Welcome to Connections, the podcast from addiction professionals of North Carolina, where we explore the nuances of addiction and mental health through the lens of policy and practice.
We're your hosts, Morgan
and Sara Howe,
and we're here to help you see how it all connects.
Today, I'm thrilled to have with us Greg Williams, the president of Third Horizon Strategy and producer of High Watch Media, and somebody you might all know who has done a lot of work in this field, particularly some of the films that have been groundbreaking to our work. So we're going to talk to Greg today about his journey as a filmmaker, the work he does now, and maybe a sneak peek about where we're going in the future with some of your films. So Greg, welcome.
Well, thanks. It's great to be here, Morgan and Sara. Thanks for having me.
We're super excited. There are so many places we could take this conversation, and I promise it's not a 3-day conversation. So we're going to jump right in. A lot of people know you as the director of The Anonymous People, which now is from 2008? Is that right?
No, it's close. 2012, I think 13. We premiered it in 2013.
Okay. So for those of you who haven't had the opportunity to meet Greg, we like to call him a little bit of famous in our field because you can walk into several of our service providers and the individuals who are seeking recovery will recognize you right away. From The Anonymous People to Generation Found, Tipping the Pain Scale. But let's go back a little bit. How'd you get to that point of putting this onto film, documenting what we know is there are people in recovery every day that live among us, and we don't know that they're on a recovery journey. How'd you get to that point?
So I got into recovery when I was 17, and I didn't think I was going to go into this field or work, in or on behalf of individuals in addiction or seeking recovery. And, so basically my story is like I lived two lives, while I was going to college and media production where, I had my recovery life and it felt very secretive to my other life, which was like a college professional life. And I kept the two identities pretty compartmentalized in my first few years of recovery. And looking back in hindsight, it felt very much like active addiction, where you compartmentalize different identities, whether you're talking to a parent, a police officer, your drug dealer or a teacher or what have you. So it was very eerily similar, compartmentalizing, different parts of my own personal identity. And I got interested in policy and sort of the finance system. And I met some folks who were part of the new recovery advocacy movement. And, I was watching them, their work around mental health, addiction, parity, and equity, and reading William White's work, who wrote Slaying the Dragon, and a lot of publications around the new recovery advocacy movement, where I really got inspired to want to make a film about these change agents, these people who are pushing on different parts of the system and bringing voices to recovery. So I got trained on how to tell my recovery story from a North Carolina local now, Betty Courier and others, and people helped me see the path. So that was the real journey, and I just started to sit down folks and ask them questions, and one thing led to another.
Were you expecting the response that the Anonymous People had?
No, I think certainly not 10 years later, that, we're still talking about it. That's mind-boggling to me. I think going through it still felt like a slow drip, like this one talking to this one. I mean, we had, at that time we're on Netflix and stuff like that, but it was an interesting time. It was just people there was a bunch of people who got fired up who didn't want to see the film, a bunch of people who got fired up from seeing the film, and it put me in sort of a controversial, instigator place, which it's it was an interesting place to be because it's a film that people have lots of preconceived ideas and beliefs about anonymity in particular in the 12-step movement. And it's hard to disrupt people's dogmatic beliefs about that. And the film intended to do that. And I think successfully did that for folks who are willing to watch it. There's still a bunch of people who won't bring themselves to watch it and try to think about it from a different perspective. But so it's always, as a documentary filmmaker, it's always good to strike the chord of controversy and in a good and productive way to kind of motivate people. But I think to your point, like these films don't make money. They're social impact films that Jeff and I make. And I think that at the end of the day, seeing the growth of recovery community centers, seeing the growth of peer recovery support services for substance use, seeing the growth of collegiate recovery programs, that's the stuff that really heartens, in terms of what the impact and the meaning. And so, that's really what matters.
I think what's cool about that, though, even like these films give us an opportunity to bring people into the conversation. Like I think about my family and they are not super knowledgeable about mental health or substance use. And they don't talk about it very much, even though it has very seriously impacted our family. And, I can say, okay, well, like, let's watch this movie. Right. And then we watch it and they're like, oh, that's what you were trying to tell me. Right. And it's like, I don't always have the right words or the right way of telling something, but this film or any of your films really for the different, areas that they cover can be that conversation starter. And it's a lot less threatening to watch a film with someone than to sit down and have a conversation about like, I want you to understand like this really complex topic. Right. And I think that's what makes it really great, even if they don't make millions of dollars at a box office somewhere.
It's population, right?
Yeah, it's the same as recovery. Like, I went to a residential treatment center as an adolescent, and to be honest, they told me the same thing that my parents had told me and other people had told me, right? That I had a problem and I needed to stop. But it's the age-old saying of when the student is ready, the teachers appear, and I think part of the family dynamics related to addiction is that part of this disease is that we can't hear each other sometimes, despite that we're sharing the same message, just because of all of the unhealed pain that happens in families related to addiction. And so like that story, more like that kind of stuff really matters because I've had a lot of experience, and it's not me, it's the messengers who are in that film, and people are hearing them and hearing their voices, and they don't have baggage with those people. They may be saying exactly what you're telling mom and dad, but it's it comes across different, I think, when it's put in a specific way. And the folks that I got to interview and have been a privilege to interview for lots of the films, I think are people who've been in the field for a long time and been in recovery for a long time. And those are messengers that I think a lot of folks haven't heard before. They might have seen, kind of the interventions of the world about addiction or stuff about, people in active treatment, but somebody with, 25, 30 years of recovery, like Stacia Murphy, she talks about this issue in a way that is far more eloquent and has more depth than folks, going through it actively.
You mentioned something about listening to your parents and being able to hear that message, and you're a parent now. So what's it like to be a parent in recovery? What messages do you share with your kids? I'm sure many of our listeners are the same. How do you address that with your kids?
Yeah, it's interesting to know like the age groups too. I I tried to take my oldest son to a screening of Tipping the Pain Scale, I think a year ago or a year and a half ago, and he was like 8.5 or 9, and it was too much for him. He wasn't. It's not, I mean, the film is great, I think, for 12, 13, 14, but it was too much for him at 8, and so it's been a tricky balance for me trying to figure out how much to share and what to share when, and around the developmental process. I just was in the car with him the other day, and he's going into 5th grade, and we started talking about drugs, and obviously the thing that terrifies me as a parent, like addiction's scary and all of that, but what's terrifying right now is the poison drug supply, and it's just adolescent overdoses are increasing again for the first time in a long time, and a lot of it isn't young people with substance use disorder. It's first time use, and it's just they're ingesting poison, and that I think is terrifying. So anyways, it's I can tell you that my family didn't, like, they came from a healthcare background and they didn't know what to do. Like, it blindsided them, and they didn't have any knowledge or training. I can't say that I probably wouldn't get blindsided by it, but I not saying I've got a silver bullet to prevent it or anything like that. But certainly, my son knows what therapy is. My son knows, about his development of his brain. My son knows about those kinds of things and coping mechanisms and coping skills and, a whole bunch of stuff about himself that at 10 that I had no knowledge about myself, before I picked up substances. So hopefully that stuff matters.
Well, and I think too, like, there's something to be said for, like, your kid seeing you live in recovery, right? Like there's, even if you're not saying like, I'm in recovery, that means I don't use substances, right? Like, they will one day reflect on their own childhoods and see what that means, and all just the way you live your life as a human being in recovery, like, impacts the father that you are, right? Like, it makes you a different father than you would be if you hadn't found recovery, right? And so I think that's all of us look back on our childhoods and have like those reflections of like, wow, my parents actually knew some stuff and they were not crazy. And I definitely probably should not have gone to that thing that they wouldn't let me go to. And that was a good choice. Right. And so I think like recovery is part of that for your family in ways that you probably won't know for another 10, 15, 20 years because your kids can't articulate it yet,
Yeah, I just celebrated 22 years last month, and I was walking the dog, and I came home, and I walked in, and they handed me like a card, my 5-year-old and 7-year-old, and and my wife and stuff, and so it's just, it's been incredible to for them to just support. Obviously, they don't fully understand the other side of it. Like, they aren't growing up around addiction. And I think the cycle of that is powerful. And I think, it's the greatest gift, to myself about being able to, be present, and be a parent.
You've dedicated your career to this in multiple ways. You've done it through the arts and through film. And then one of the things that I've said to you before that amazes me is that you have an artistic side, and then you can work an Excel spreadsheet like nobody's business and talk about alternative payment methodologies and really the financing of this system, right? You talked about really two very critical things, because if we can't pay for it, how are people going to get the care, right? And then we have to really cut down on that stigma, which is what the films and the work that you do. Tell us a little bit more about the next film and what you're hoping to accomplish with the next project.
Yeah, well, we have a couple projects, in development, and I'm privileged to get to do a lot of this with the incredibly talented Jeff Riley, who's the director of Generation Found and co-creator of Anonymous People and director of Tipping the Pain Scale and editor, and so we're finishing up a film, actually a sports film around the Jensen brothers. Who are tennis doubles, and they won the French Open in '93, and they Murphy Jensen became actively addicted and has a harrowing story of his journey through active addiction and recovery, and his relationship with his brother Luke, while being the third biggest draw in tennis behind Connors, Agassi, and the Jensen brothers, and so. So that project is going on, and then we're working on developing some other projects, in the works around NIMBY issues with local zoning boards and opening programs, and how to capture what's happening in local communities. I think we see a lot of funding coming from the federal government, coming from states, coming from even philanthropy in some respects, but when it comes down to it, we have a treatment gap, and we have a significant treatment gap for those who are in need, for those who can access services. And the problem is when you try to open a program in a local community, it's not always about the money. Sometimes people have the money to open the program. Sometimes people have the willingness to open the program. And it becomes about politics, and it becomes about the political will of the community to allow a program that's supporting recovery take shape, whether that's a recovery home, whether that's a treatment center, whether that's a sobering center, which we're seeing in a lot more communities. But it's just this inevitable, not in my backyard, and people rise up over cell phone towers and all sorts of stuff in their local communities that they don't want in their backyard. But this, unfortunately, we know from the data is in everybody's backyard. And we know that, having programs supporting people reduces crime, increases economic growth of communities, and can, transform, this issue. And I think it's sad that there's so much stigma still yet to resolve for people, and it's going to happen. Change is going to have to be local, and in a lot of ways, because so much of this issue is related to the local dynamics around how people find and sustain recovery and get well.
So as we wrap up our conversation today, for those listeners who have experienced that in their communities, that are starting to see that, or they're trying to get something open and they're getting some pushback, what do you recommend they do? How can they maybe get involved so that they can support this movement to bring more services to bear, which we know, like you said, there's a giant gap. What would you tell them?
I think the first and most important thing is that of the cases that I've looked at, by and large, the municipal zoning board or county zoning board, they act illegally, and it's against the Fair Housing Act. It's against the ADA a lot of times when they make these determinations that don't have any basis in fact and don't have any basis in reasonable zoning violations or anything. And so unfortunately, there's no simple answer, but a lot of it relies on fighting and have to get some lawyers involved, but by and large, most treatment programs, recovery houses, addiction programs at large who have fought back against stigma and discrimination, if they stick with it, they win. And sometimes they win big settlements from the community who violated the law. And so, importantly, DOJ, the Department of Justice, the Federal Department of Justice clarified that it is a violation of the American Disabilities Act to not allow a recovery house, and that kind of thing. So there's decent precedent now, but it's not stopping local zoning boards from trying. It's like the same with insurance companies who used to deny care, and hope that you would just go away and stop coming back.
Giving up and walking away, not being able to afford the lawyers, right? And
and I think it's important to note, though, Greg, and I hope your film's able to showcase this, if it is, that in those communities where they've prevailed, if you go back a year or two later, they're the best neighbor there is. I mean, they love them. The conversation, oh, they're great. We're glad to have them. And, all of their concerns that they bring, with their pitchfork, so to speak, they don't bear out. We don't see that. So I think it's
not a logic issue, right?
Yeah, it's not.
If logic could fix it.
No, I toured and there's 40 years of history, but there's a great nonprofit outside the Pennsylvania area, Philadelphia, and there's an elementary school and a legacy addiction treatment provider. No fences, no walls. It's a nice setting on a campus across from a hospital. And it's they're great. They're great neighbors, and they've got decades of experience. And it's just fear. I mean, people just unfortunately, it's fear and pain. I mean, that's the bottom line. Unfortunately. The hard part working on this issue is there's a lot of unhealed pain, and addiction, for better or worse, like connects with everybody, but it doesn't always connect for people in a positive way. Either they grew up around addiction and they have a lot of unhealed pain, they've lost somebody from addiction, and they have unhealed pain around it, or they've been harmed by somebody in active addiction. And so I think we just, we have to acknowledge that no matter which room you walk into, where you walk into, everybody's been touched by this issue, but that's not always a positive, because the issue is complicated.
It's an important reminder. It's very personal to many people. Well, first of all, thank you for what you're doing and for taking the time to come talk to us today. And also, as you wrap up a couple of those films, we hope you'll come back and tell us the response you're getting, because we'd love to continue that. So thank you again for that.
Yeah, thanks so much. We appreciate you joining us.
Yep.
Yeah, well, thanks APNC for everything you guys do, and keep up the good fight.
Yep, definitely.